Moving on to the final question that we posed at the beginning of week one. So, does foreign trade positively impact on welfare? And this question I kind of answered earlier. Usually speaking, if this had been a class, I would have posed this towards the class, or if this had been an interactive class, I would have posed it. So just give a bit of thought here. I'll count till 5 and I'll move to the answer. So the main thing we spoke about earlier in terms of it impacting positively, exports allow for growth of income, or GDP, whatever you want to see this in terms of. And with that growth, there is definitely job growth, job creation. And then there's also a side, there's also now cheaper imports that can exist. So that could save the consumer paying for something cheaper. And then the competition, they can remove the inefficiencies because under autarky, a company could have asked such incredible expensive prices because nobody else could compete with it or nobody else was producing the product. But as soon as you open yourself up to the world, you can't ask that prices because someone else can come along and say, hey, we can produce this good a lot cheaper from this country and that country. And then another good thing about a positive impact is the variety of goods. Because now you're not just getting the goods that's produced in your country, you get exposed to other goods produced in other countries. Moving on away from the questions, as I say, lecture one is just a whole lot of taking things from that week 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, and there's no real flow to that. The flow only starts from week two because those earlier week one lectures are designed just to give you a broad overview or a little basis of what's to come. So, what are the things that impact on international trade? And the most easiest thing to think about is government. Government is the one is going to come along and regulate this industry of exports and imports. How do they do that? Through taxation. How is this taxation? We're going to discuss these different type of export tariffs and import tariffs and quotas and all these funny things at a later stage, but they can come in and impact on this industry. Why do they do it? Why are they coming in? Are they coming here to fix the distortions that happen in the market, which maybe the invisible hand is not going to take care of? Not necessarily. As we find a lot, the incentive of government to jump in the industry is to generate revenue, to run itself, push the money that the revenue that they gain into industries that they feel might need it. And the second idea is to protect the industry because opening yourself up might be that you just cannot compete with another international country. So you're going to impose certain price increasing movements on a competitive firm from an international company. So by you putting on an import tax or import tariff, you're going to make the good more expensive and then allow your nationally produced good to be more competitive. And there's also other ideas. Otherwise, other reason why government intervenes, and that's more from a broader economic strategy point of view. Sometimes you're trying, or sometimes government is intervening to allow for your industry to develop. So they might try to do this to encourage import substitution, protection. What do I mean by that? So what you're trying to do is instead of importing the good from overseas, maybe you're trying to allow for your country to produce that good. So that's what he's trying to do. So you raise the prices of the competitive international firm, and by raising their prices, you allow for your firms to grow and produce as good. So this is what you call import substitution. changing all imports into domestic production. And then there's the other idea of export oriented development. Um, you really want to compete or grow by exporting, so you need government to intervene to make your exports cheaper. How they do that? Export subsidies, stuff like that. There also are other ways of protecting the market in a more subtle way than doing tariffs, and that's with the non-tariff barriers. And just an example for your sake, what a non-tariff barrier example could be, you might stipulate a certain health regulation for good. So if that good from overseas coming in doesn't meet that health regulation, and then you won't allow it into the country. So maybe like that, standard checking, whatever. You can do different type of things to prevent this good coming. And we'll look a bit more at other examples later on in the other weeks to come. We also have other things that hampers international trade besides government, and that's natural barriers. So freight costs are one of them. If it's too expensive for you to send a good from your country to another country, then you might not enter into any trade, even if your good is produced cheaper in your country. But when you filter in how much freight or shipping this good to somewhere else is, you might just decide, wait, this is not worthwhile. We can't compete with that international price when we filter in our cost to ship. And then the other idea is that what you're shipping around could be very expensive, and the insurance to cover this goods moving from your country to the other country that you're exporting to might be too expensive. So these are some of the natural barriers that exist. So what has come along? So in order to prevent your government from imposing whatever tariffs or sanctions or whatever they want to do, they have formed, there are organizations that are formed to allow or to try to insist on you removing these barriers. So a lot of the countries across the world belong to maybe the World Trade Organization. This is WTO. So then they form this agreement. So in order for you to trade with another country, you need to confine to the rules and the regulations that they put forth. And usually the rules and the regulations is for you not to have rules and regulations in your country, not to have import tariffs, not to have export tariffs and all these funny things. And then there are other types of liberations that you incur to remove your barriers is then when you into agreements with another country. So FTA here means a free trade agreement. So you might enter an agreement with another country and you say, okay, between us two, we're gonna drop import tariffs and export tariffs between us. Maybe drop it to zero. Maybe you agreement that you drop it to a certain percentage, something like that. And then you get idea of a customs union, and that is just, as we will discuss and we'll see soon, those are all ways to remove barriers. This is part 2 of week 1. As you see, I've broken the lectures up to 1A, 1B, 1C, just to make it maybe easier for you to do in small pieces if you don't want to do the whole lecture, which is probably be a 2-hour lecture or 3-hour lecture depending for week 1. So section 2 is looking at the nature, importance, and the composition of international trade. So this covers one of your papers, either 1C or 1D, I can't remember. So the main thing to remember, between 1000 and 1820, there wasn't a lot of growth compared to what has happened since the 1800s. So since the 1800s till now, there's been a tremendous amount of growth. Imagine that. For 800 years, from 1000 to 1800s, there was only 50% growth. And now all of a sudden, post 1820, we have over 800% growth. That's ridiculous. Just in terms of commerce, we're talking, right? This is just after the Industrial Revolution came. I mean, even what happened in that time? There was 2 world wars, and yet growth was still tremendous. But these are these things like the Industrial Revolution and the two World Wars, if you look at the map and you find that map in the reading, which looks similar to this. Something goes up and then it rapidly goes up. You'll find is maybe a little blimp like that. And these blimps that occur here in here, you can relate them to the war stepping in. Because during that time, economies took a knock. All production shifted to ammunitions and stuff like that. This is not a real map, right? Go find that map in your book. Discuss it or Google it or something like that. It's not really important for for this course. You just need to understand that growth was the rate of growth from 1000 to 1800 was only 50%. But yet, for 200 years, slightly over 200 years, it's ridiculously much, went up to 800%. And also, what you find that usually with certain events that are happening in the world, that in when anything goes badly for a country, when anything goes badly in the world, the first premise or the first thing that a country does is look out for itself. So how do they do that? How do you look out for yourself? You impose tariffs. You prevent any trade coming in, and you try to make your product cheaper relative to their product in your country, and trying to sell your product all over the world so you can stimulate production in your economy. Don't worry about the rest. You cut out all the rest. You want to sell to them, but you do not want to buy from them. You want them to buy from you, looking for your own growth in that. So that was happening the Great Depression. When things started going terrible, the first thing most countries did was let's put up a huge tariff on manufactured goods to protect their own markets. And based on all these lessons learned, then especially after the World War II, they formed the GATT agreement, or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to try to promote more free trade. So the countries don't look out for themselves, and that we think about everybody collectively. All in all, what it means is, especially with tariffs existing, there can be three forms of trade. You can have a restricted trade, we have high tariffs just to protect your industry and just wanting to sell your own goods and not really buy from other countries. Then you can have a managed free trade system to keep low tariffs, and you mainly do this through subsidies. So you're trying to get trade from you're trying to buy and from other countries, and you're trying to sell to other countries. You're trying to keep some form of balance in a sense, but both of you have tariffs, but not so high. And then you get the unbridled trade, and they're just trying to keep everything to minimum. Minimum. All the tariffs is on the less, almost 0%, subsidies almost 0%, and your regulations you're trying to have as little regulations possible to make it as if whatever price is best in the world, that's the price we're going for. We're not going to try to alter these prices by any type of regulation or tariffs. So what is the importance of international trade? What are we moving to? As you see in the world, especially with internet and that, and the way the connectiveness of the world is, we're trying to move to a borderless world where we're not governed by one firm here in this world, one firm in that country, and they're competing with each other. We're trying to have more of multinational conglomerates or value chain system, meaning that 4 or 5 countries are working together to produce this good. Maybe South Africa is the country that mines the resource. They send it maybe to Namibia. Namibia takes this resource, and then they produce, maybe say maybe we're taking iron ore from South Africa and they produce metal, and we're taking this metal and we're shipping to China. China is then taking this metal and making it into um, whatever manufactured good. So we're trying to move to that type of system where, or that is where the world is moving into more of a conglomerate. Another way of seeing this is South Africa produces door for a car. Another country produces the windows because they're better at it, another country assembles all the goods. So they assemble this doors, they assemble this windows from this one country. All the parts are coming from different countries in another, and then again assemble. Because all those countries can produce that certain item on their car cheapest. So this is maybe the way the world is moving. We've also seen that more so than thinking out of yourself, exports can help economic growth. And building ties is probably better over a longer period, and it helps maybe more with poverty than looking out for yourself. Because I mean, why? You have one country, you have 60 million people. There's only 60 million people you're selling to. But if you open yourself to the world, it's not only 60 million. He's got the next country which is 20 million, that country which is 50 million, another country is 5 million. So you're allowing yourself to sell to a lot more. It's more potential to sell to. At the same time, yes, there's other people who are gonna have your 60 million people might not buy from you now, might buy somewhere else. So it's finding that balance. But if you're the cheapest in a certain product, that means you open yourself to the whole 6 billion, 8 billion, whatever amount of people that live in the world. That's what you expose yourself to selling to. But what we have seen, even through having all these borderless worlds and all these ideas that you're selling to a lot of people, we still find that a lot of low income countries are not grown. They're not even integrated in the world, and they're actually falling apart. Some say it's got to do with the type of politics happening in the country. Some people say it's got to do with infrastructure. Why that infrastructure? Some people blame colonialism. So some people might blame that these wealthy countries, what they've done is just put a whole lot of tariffs on to prevent these products from these low income countries coming in and then looking out for themselves or only for the rich countries. So a lot of things that pop up in this respect. So as you find in your readings, you'll probably read something on global and regional trade flows, then self-study, and then the thing on international trade organizations, knowing what the UN is, what they're about, what it stands for, knowing what the WTO is, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, all these, then their roles and the National Monetary Federation, whatever they are, knowing what this organization is important. Am I really going to test you what the WTO is, what its functions is? Never. I don't think I'll do that. That's not so important for me. Is you understanding Africa more and its role it plays in the international trade is more important than knowing these organizations. So I'm not going to ask you these organizations, but I'll definitely ask you what is STATIC as an organization, what is um, NAFTA and those type of things. Things that relate to trade, but not these international organizations. So read through it. You probably would have read through all the summaries. And then lastly, regional economic integration, or what we'll be covering in week 7, 8, and 9, if I'm not mistaken. 10 included, maybe 6, I can't remember. So we're covering in the middle to later part of the weeks. So regional economic integration or regional integration has got to do with forming trade blocks. Areas of countries which are going to trade with each other and sell together. And the idea of forming free trade areas. Areas of countries or locations of countries that are working together where they're not imposing tariffs on each other. So with this, even though you're forming these agreements, you're going to still need to have some political cooperation. And there's a problem, some countries are fighting or in conflict with each other. Maybe these agreements will help with the conflict and the fighting in these countries. And just having regional economic integration is not the reason that the countries will do well together. You can't say, oh, I'm forming a partnership with this country. I have a free trade agreement with him. Oh, we're not going to impose a lot of tariffs. Things are going to go well. That's not a necessary reason for having good trade or having good development in your country. You could find that you enter into a relationship with a few countries and now you're buying from this one country, but this country is not the cheapest, but you enter into a relation with this country that you're going to buy with them. And then you find there's another country somewhere across the world which would have been better to buy from him because he was selling the product for cheaper. But why were you not buying from this other country? It was cheaper because you might have imposed a tariff on this country, which you have no agreement with, and made this price much more expensive than this other country as part of your agreement. So this is something you have to look out for. You can form agreements with other countries and into relationship with other countries, but is this relationship best overall? Am I cutting out the producer from other places outside these countries are form a relationship, which would have been cheaper if I had to actually include him and allowed that country and my country not to impose tariffs against each other. So let's look at what a successful trade bloc is, NAFTA. So why did it work really well? You're in the same geographical area, that really helps. You're very close to each other, it's easier transport cost wise and everything. Plus, you probably have similar climate conditions and stuff like that. And the cultures, because you're close to each other, could possibly be very similar. And you have direct access to each other. It's not 10 borders I need to go over because I have to go through this country and that country to get you. You're right next to me, I can immediately send your goods to you or into a relationship with you. They also have excellent geographic mobility between them. That means they had excellent the plane system between them, the railroad between them, the seaport routes and everything was really well coordinated between them and of a good function. They ran really well. All these countries also had a vast amount of natural resources that helps. All of them had large populations, very big labor capacity between them. They also had very well trained manufacturing skills. The people were really well trained in both, and they had nice technology capabilities. So they produced the skill set that is really good between all three US countries. Remember, who's NAFTA? North America, right? So that is Mexico, Canada, and America. You might argue now it's a bit different with the political aspect that the USA is doing, but when this agreement was put in place, it was a really good idea and it's been running really well. And then also, each three of these countries have a big entrepreneurial culture. So that means good for firms starting up and that and developing further. And they have stuff in writing. They have a formal treaty which allows them, which governs their relationship. So if you have laws and that and you stick to the rules, it helps a lot. And they've also made the efforts to reduce the tariffs between each other. It's not saying, oh, I'm going to do this and I didn't do this. So they said, okay, we're going to drop our tariffs from 20% to 10%, for example, and they actually carried out with what they said. It's not about it just word, we're going to do this. There's no plan and without action. So there have been people with action. So the linear model, as you know, yes, you can find the other model as maybe in between steps in different places, but the model that I'm looking at is the linear model that I'm looking at starts with a free trade agreement. Customs then moves to a custom union, then moves to a common market, and moves to economic union, and moves to a political union. So you need to know this, and you need to know what a free trade agreement means, what a custom union means, what a common market means. Just one line, especially if we're discussing this if it comes up. Don't write me a whole essay what economic union means, and a whole essay what political union means. Write one nice fact about it that sums up everything about it. Because I mean, you're supposed to know the things based on your undergraduate course. So as a reminder, free trade agreement, you're trying to promote free trade, and that means your tariffs are going to be reduced amongst all members of this agreement. But each member still has their own policy with other countries. With all those are not part of the agreement, they're non-members, they still have their own policy on tariffs with those countries. With the custom unions, what it means is we still have the free trade agreement, but now we have a collective policy to non-members. All people are not part of our agreement. We have the same tariffs we set against all those countries, or the same policy in terms of trade against all these non-members. Common market, so that would entail having a custom union and a free trade agreement. Just means now all factors or factor mobility between members. So that means interchange each a laborer in one country, in one member country, can work in another member country with no issues. None of this visa and all these funny things. It's just everything is seen. It's almost like combining all three countries, if it was three countries, all these countries together, all members together, and you can move freely and go work freely between them. And then you have the economic union, which entails all the above discussed earlier, and just means something like there's a common currency, or they have at least a fixed exchange rate. It's not changing amongst all members. So things are very harmonized, and we're trying to also get monetary and fiscal policy that's basically the same, and tax regimes that are the same amongst all member states. So economic union, an example of an economic union would be, I heard someone say it, European Union, EU. And then lastly, something that is the ultimate dream of what would be is having a political union, so that you have some central political board that decides on all economic issues, all social issues, all foreign policies for all members. That's the ideal to have that. Um, yeah, that is probably one of the most difficult thing to do. You probably had that it was like a president for all countries, and that president makes a decision for all countries, something like that. And that's it for week one. If you have any questions, if I lost you somewhere, just refer me to whichever slide it was or which lecture it was, and tell me at which time in the slide it was or something, and I can maybe explain it better over WhatsApp or something like that.